Muy buenos días, muy buenas tardes y muy buenas
Good
noches
morning,
también, según la región
good
desde donde nos
afternoon, and good
acompañen.
evening as well,
Damos una
depending on
cordial
the region
bienvenida
you
al
are
tercer
joining
y
us
último
from.
foro de esta
Welcome to
serie de
the
conversaciones virtuales sobre El Salvador. Gracias por estar aquí con nosotras y nosotros, compartiendo un espacio para el análisis, el diálogo crítico y la reflexión colectiva. Esta serie en Alianza Américas nació con la intención de formular preguntas y escuchar voces independientes frente a un momento
and
histórico
in light
complejo en
of
El
a
Salvador.
historic and complex
El
moment
pasado
in
4
El
de julio
Salvador.
comenzamos preguntándonos
And
cuál es la
we
situación de los
started
derechos
asking
humanos en El
back in
Salvador.
June 4th, what is the
Conversamos sobre las
situation of our
denuncias
brothers
de
and sisters
detenciones
in El
arbitrarias,
Salvador? Started talking
torturas y
about the
desapariciones
claims of
forzadas
arbitrary
bajo el régimen
detentions,
de excepción,
tortures
así
under the
como el
state of
cierre del
emergency,
espacio cívico y
as
las
well as
limitaciones a la prensa
the
y a las
shutting
libertades
down the
públicas.
civic spaces
Luego,
and
el 20 de
repression to
junio,
the press and
profundizamos
civil
en
society.
una pregunta
And
fundamental.
then we talked
¿Por
about a
qué se instauró un
fundamental
régimen de
question.
excepción?
Why was the state of
Analizamos junto a
emergency
periodistas las
initiated?
narrativas
We
de seguridad
analyzed, along
en
with
relación a la
journalists,
concentración de poder,
the,
el uso
the
político de
issue
la
of
figura del
concentration
enemigo
of
interno
power,
y los
the use
impactos
of
de estas
the
medidas en la
internal or foreign
institucionalidad
enemy act,
democrática y la
and
vida
the
cotidiana de
use of
miles de personas.
institutions and how it
Hoy,
affects the daily
en
lives
este
of
tercer y
millions of
último
people.
encuentro,
Today, in
queremos
the third
explorar
and
el
final
poder
meeting,
del
we want to talk
discurso
about
oficial.
the
Nos
power of the
preguntamos
official
entonces,
discourse. We
¿cuál es el
ask
impacto de la
ourselves,
narrativa
what is the
oficial
impact
en la
of the
opinión
official
pública?
narrative on public
En un
opinion?
contexto donde el gobierno
In the
salvadoreño
context where
despliega
the
una
El
extensa
Salvador government
estrategia comunicacional,
deploys an
tanto
enormous
como fuera del
communication
país,
strategy, whether
nos
inside
interesa
or
analizar
outside the
cómo se
country,
construye
we're
esa
interested in
narrativa y cómo
analyzing how
modela
that
percepciones
narrative,
colectivas
how does
y
it
qué
shape
efectos tiene en la diáspora,
perception and
en las
what effects
comunidades
does it have on
migrantes
the
y en los
diaspora, on the
espacios
migrant
públicos.
communities and the
Para
crucial
guiarnos en esta
spaces. In
conversación,
order to
tenemos el
guide us for this
privilegio de
conversation, we have the
contar con
privilege
una persona
of
experta que ha
having an
investigado a
expert
fondo las
who
relaciones
has
entre medios, poder,
investigated
cultura y
deeply the
migración.
use of power,
William
culture, and
Carballo,
immigration. William
bienvenido.
Carvalho, welcome.
William es
Muchas
investigador.
gracias.
Muchas gracias a
Will,
ti. William es
thank
investigador
you. William is
académico,
an
periodista y
investigator, a
ensayista
teacher, a
salvadoreño.
journalist
Es
from El
doctorando en
Salvador
Sociedad de la
who has a
Información y el
doctorate in
Conocimiento en la Universidad
information and
Abierta de
knowledge
Cataluña
in the
y un máster en
Catalunya
comunicación
University
de
and
la
has a master's
Universidad
degree in
Interamericana de El Salvador.
communication in the El Salvador
En
Central
la
American.
actualidad es director de
Currently,
investigación
he's a
en la Escuela
research
Mónica
head
Herrera.
in the Monica
Muchas
Herrera
gracias, William.
School.
Bienvenido.
Thank you,
Vamos
William.
a hacer una
Welcome.
breve introducción
We're going to give a
con
brief
respecto a
introduction with
que
regards
invitamos
to
a
that
la audiencia a escuchar,
we invite the
preguntar y
audience,
dialogar con mente
listen,
abierta y
ask,
espíritu
and
crítico
dialogue with an
y
open
que
mind and a
podrán enviar sus
critical spirit.
preguntas en la
And for
sección
similar
o caja
questions, just
de
in the
questions and answers
Q&A
y ya,
box or
en la que
section,
tendremos un espacio para
since we will
abordarlas.
have address your
Comenzamos entonces.
questions. Let's begin.
William, muchas gracias
William,
nuevamente por tu
thank
presencia
once
acá.
again, thank you
Sabemos
for
lo
your
difícil
presence
que se
here.
encuentra la
Know
situación
how
salvadoreña a nivel
difficult the
político,
situation
pero a
currently is
pesar
at a
de todo
political
ello,
level,
nos
but
interesa
despite
muchísimo
all
conocer
things,
sobre la
we're interested
narrativa.
to know about the
La primera
narrative.
pregunta va para
The
ti.
first question is for
¿Cómo se
you.
ha construido la
How has
narrativa oficial del actual gobierno
official
salvadoreño
narrative of
en
the
los
current
medios y
government
redes
been built
sociales?
in
Es decir,
media and
¿qué
social
elementos simbólicos,
media outlets and
emocionales
social
o
media?
discursivos
What
crees que le
emotional
caracterizan?
or cultural
Ok, bueno,
aspects
primero muchas
characterize or
gracias por la
shape this
invitación
narrative?
y
First of all,
gracias
thank you
por
for this
ponernos frente a este
invitation
tema.
and thank
Muchas
you
veces
for
nos
this
preguntamos,
topic on the
o
agenda.
muchas
Many
veces
times
dejamos de
we
lado el tema de las
ask
narrativas
ourselves,
mediáticas,
we
pero
don't
sí es
ignore
importante hablarlo, sobre todo en terrenos políticos, y
the
entonces en ese
media
contexto
narrative,
explicar también por qué es
specifically in
importante
political
situar
context.
este
So
tema
right now
dentro de
it's
este tipo
very
de
important.
discusiones.
So it's
En cuanto a tu
important that it's
pregunta
part of these
concreta,
types of discussions.
pues la narrativa
Or question,
oficialista en El Salvador
official
ha sido
narrative in El
bastante estudiada
Salvador
por diferentes
by
autores.
different
Y a
authors.
partir de ahí voy a
And
basarme
starting from
en un
there, we're
resumen que yo
gonna
considero
that I
que
consider
nos están comunicando
is
desde la narrativa
it's what
oficial,
they're communicating.
y que de cierta manera hay que
And
adelantar,
in a
ha
certain
tenido
way,
bastante
we
éxito la
have to
manera en
mention
la
that it
cual
has been very
se
successful
están comunicando
the
con todos
way
nosotros.
they are
Por ejemplo, la
communicating
mayoría de
with us.
autores
For
que
example,
han
the
trabajado este tema
majority of
sobre las
the
narrativas mediáticas del
authors
actual
that have
gobierno de El
worked
Salvador
on the media
está hablando
narrative
primero
is talking,
de que no se
first
trata
of
de una
all, that
narrativa que
it's
aborde
not
todos los
about a
temas,
narrative is
se
one
concentra en
just one
muchas
topic.
causas. Y
Instead, it's
una, por
focused
supuesto,
on
la que
many
creo que es la más
causes. And I
importante
think
ha
that the
sido el
most
tema de
important
seguridad.
has been security.
Ahora, este tema de seguridad,
Now,
¿cómo lo
this
abordan?
security
Ahí
topic,
se
the
me hace
way
un poco
it's
la diferencia
addressed
porque también otros gobiernos de otros
lies
países
because
también
other
utilizan
governments
el
from
tema de la
other
seguridad como un
countries
tema
use
bandera. Sin
security
embargo, creo
as
que
the
la
flag bearer for their
combinación de
narrative.
elementos
However, the
marca
combination
la
of other
diferencia de El
elements
Salvador de
has
otras
differentiated El Salvador from
otras
other
narrativas en otros países.
communication
Por ejemplo,
processes,
hay
or the,
en este país y también según
for
otros autores,
example,
hay una
in this
combinación entre esta
country,
narrativa
there's
de
a combination
rituales
between religious
y de mano
narrative
dura,
and
donde
of a
el
firm
aspecto
hand,
militar,
firm strategy, where the
usted sabe, las
military
fuerzas
has
tanto policiales
the
como
police
militares
forces as well as
toman
the
mucha
military
presencia. Es bien
forces
curiosa esta
are
mezcla porque por un
veiling.
lado
This combination is
está todo un
curious
elemento
because
mitológico en torno a la
there's
religión,
a
en torno a
mythological
Dios,
aspect with
la
regards to
Biblia,
religion, God,
eh,
the Bible,
estas conversaciones espirituales que
conversations,
tiene el
spiritual
presidente,
conversations that
que él dice tener, que el presidente dice tener.
the
Esto lo
president
hizo
claims that he has. As a matter of
en
fact,
aquel suceso cuando llegó a la Asamblea
he
Legislativa,
did it when he
pero a la vez
went
vemos
to
un
the Legislative
elemento tal
Assembly,
vez mítico
but
de
he
lo
combines
religioso
this
que
almost
convierte
mythic
un
aspect, this
elemento de mucha
religious
fuerza,
aspect. He
de
combines it with an
mostrarse
element,
como
a
un
lot of
gobierno de mucha fuerza. Entonces son
displaying
curiosos
themselves
porque
as
son
a
dos elementos
government
que
with a lot of
contrastan muy
strength.
seguido
It's curious
en la
because it's
cultura
two elements
latinoamericana. Sí,
present in
lo
Latin American
religioso en
culture,
América Latina
where
es una
Latin
zona de
America
dominio
is
donde
the world
tienen un
where
poder importante
the
y lógicamente
religion
tienen
has an
mucha más fuerza.
important
Y
strength,
por el otro lado,
especially Christianity.
y a mí me
And on the
parece
other
tienen esta
hand,
tradición
Latin America has a
de
long
apoyar este
tradition
tema
of
de la
supporting
fuerza
this of force or
y de
strength,
mostrarse como que la dureza es la solución
showing
a muchos de los
themselves that
problemas. Entonces,
being
este
showing
gobierno ha
a firm hand
logrado
is the solution to
mezclar
many
en una
problems.
misma narrativa
This
los temas
government has been
religiosos
able
con el
to
tema de la mano
combine
dura
religious
en
aspects
función del tema de la
as
seguridad.
showing a
Y
firm
eso, a
hand
mi juicio, ha
when it comes
sido
to security. And in
muy,
my opinion,
una clave muy
that has
importante
been
para lograrlo.
a
Pero
very
lo último,
important way to achieve
paralelamente,
this.
otros
This is
autores
not
nos han
the
dicho
only
que
way. At the same time,
existe
these
un
authors
discurso
have
que
told
pretende
us
ser
that there's a discourse that
ahistórico.
intends to
¿A qué nos
be,
referimos con
what
ahistórico?
do I
Es
mean?
decir,
Ahistoric? What does this
pretende
mean?
borrar la
That they
historia
intend to
anterior. Es decir,
anti-history.
como
They
que de alguna
want
manera
to erase
todo
prior
lo que pasó antes de la llegada
words,
del
that
actual
everything that happened
funcionario
before the arrival of this
no
current
existió.
president
Y si
did not
existió fue
occur.
tan mal
And if it did
que vale
exist,
la
it
pena
was
borrarlo.
so bad,
Entonces,
it's
a
worth
eso nos referimos.
eliminating or
Hay un
erasing.
discurso, una narrativa
There's a
donde
narrative
parece
or
que
a
el
discourse where
país
it
inició su
seems that
verdadera
the
historia a
country
partir del
did
2019
its true history
y
starting in
todo lo que hubo
2019,
antes
and that everything that
nada
occurred
más
before this,
fue un
it's
camino
more of a
tortuoso que había que vivir según esta
torturous
narrativa para
path
poder
that
llegar
they had to
finalmente
experience in
a
order
este
to
momento
reach
donde
or live
la,
at
entre
this
comillas,
moment
verdadera
where,
historia del país
quote unquote, the true
está empezando.
of the
Entonces,
country
ese sería otro
is
elemento
beginning.
importante. Y el último
Element.
elemento
And the last
es un
element
recurso que también es
is
muy
a
usado
resource
por
that
diferentes
is used by
gobernantes en el
many
mundo y lo hemos
governors
propuesto en
or
otros
presidents
parlamentos
throughout the
de
world
América
and
Latina.
other
Y
presidents in
tiene que
Latin
ver con una construcción
has to do with
teatralizada
it's
de lo que pasa en el
almost
país. ¿Qué
creating,
significa teatralizada? Bueno, casi dramatizada, donde
or it's
existe
like
por un
it's
lado un
dramatized,
héroe
where
y existe por el
we
otro
have a
lado
hero,
villanos. Y
and
este
on the other
gobierno
hand, there are the
ha
villains.
sabido
And
escoger
this government in
quién va a ser el
particular
villano.
has
Por un lado, Juan
chosen
Díaz,
who the
pero por el
hero
otro
will
lado
be and who
eran
the
también o
villains.
son también
Inside,
todo este
we have the
conjunto
gangs, and on the
de
other side,
partidos políticos que
this
estuvieron en el
whole,
poder
and we also include all
y
these political parties that used to be in
causaron
power,
diferentes problemas
and
en el
they
país, sobre
cause
todo por
different
problemas
problems
de
for the
corrupción.
country.
Entonces, ante esos
Corruption.
villanos,
So, because of
la narrativa
these
oficial
villains,
actual ha
the
sabido
current
construir
official
a un
narrative
presidente que se vende entonces como
created
un
this
héroe que viene
president
a
who is
rescatar al país de
displayed
eso,
as
pero
this
lo
type of
hace,
hero
y
who
esto es
has come to
importante,
rescue the
no de
country.
una manera convencional,
But this
sino que
is
lo
done
hace
not in a
instalado en el
traditional
siglo
way,
XXI,
instead
específicamente
installed in
en la
the
época de la era
21st
digital.
century, in
Entonces
the
ya no es
digital
simplemente
era.
el
So he's no
héroe de
longer
los años
a
80 o 90,
hero
sino
from
que
the
ahora es el héroe
80s or 90s. Instead,
que
he's the hero
combate a través de mensajes en
battles
redes sociales
through
famosas,
messages in
que
social
utiliza la
media,
cultura
that
popular
he
y
uses the
utiliza los
popular
canales
culture
digitales
and uses
para
digital
hacer llegar el
means
mensaje.
or
Entonces,
channels
por lo
to
menos
transmit their
algunos
messages.
autores así lo han
So
definido
some
como un
this is how
héroe cool y
I find
millennial
him as a
que salvará
cool
al
and
país de
millennial
ese mal
who
que
save the country from this evil
ha arruinado el país
in the country for almost 200 years, where to the point where we're talking about a new history that is starting built in 2019, where they built this narrative. I would say that the current narrative, based on the studies that have been conducting this narrative, have to do with a strategy based on religious messages and messages related to security that is supplemented with a discourse that intends to erase history and as if nothing good happened before, and at the same time dramatizing it. They say there's villains and there's also a hero, and we have a hero that is using a cool digital and modern. That would be an initial definition of how this
De
narrative is
acuerdo,
built.
muchísimas gracias.
I
Bueno,
agree. Thank you very
es
much.
interesante entonces
It is
cómo
interesting how
un poco
you
el que sí
describe
existían
that
sincretismos en la sociedad salvadoreña en este sentido entre
certain
un Mesías y un strongman o
similarities between
un líder de los de antaño, ¿no?
between
Ese que
a
está
strongman
amalgamando
hero.
todas esas
It's like an
tendencias
amalgamation of all
dentro de la
these
sociedad salvadoreña.
tendencies of the
Y eso me lleva a pensar
Salvadoran
también en la gente de la
history.
diáspora
And that makes me
de
think
El
about the
Salvador.
people in the diaspora, those
Obviamente
who are
fueron sido
outside El
también
Obviously, El
víctimas
Salvador has
de los
been a
tiempos
victim
árabes, ¿no?
of
De
forced
cambios en el
migration for
país por
decades
diferentes
now,
razones, no solamente
due
por
to different
la crisis
reasons,
social
not only
de
the
los
social
70
and
la
political
guerra
crisis
después de
of the
los 80
70s,
y
the,
posteriormente el auge de las pandillas a partir
and
de
of
mediados de
course
los
the
90.
rise of
Eh,
gangs in the mid
¿Y
90s.
qué
In your
impacto tiene esta
opinion,
narrativa
what
en la
impact does
manera en
this
que se
narrative
percibe
have in the
tanto la
way
violencia, la
they
migración o el
perceive
régimen
violence
receptivo?
and
Es decir,
migration and the
¿hay
state of
diferencias cuando la
are
audiencia
there differences when the
está dentro del
audience
país
is
y cuando
within the
se trata de la
country
diáspora
compared
salvadoreña
to
con la
the
comunidad internacional?
Salvadoran diaspora or the international community? Yes, I think it's important mentioning that in the El Salvador government, especially the president, they were able to understand the importance of this segment of the population, of these people that are outside the country but are still citizens of El Salvador and participate in the political and economic ways. I think that they understood this. Valderino, an important author in El Salvador, he wrote this that the politician understood the enormous influence of the on the political behavior of their relatives without collecting them strategy social media. I think that effectively the current government understood something that many their predecessors did not understand. Another author by the name of Benitez mentioned that the sector, this sector, economically speaking, or culturally speaking, and now politically speaking, this influence is so important and had not been heard previously. Use it not to highlight, not a lot, not that it highlights a lot because it paid attention or it paid attention to this population, this group of the population, this diaspora. So yes, I know that there's an interest from the government to communicate directly with those part of El Salvador that's outside the country, in other words, the diaspora. So they understand that this is random. Everything is well planned. How does it impact? Well, as a matter of fact, it's we in school, at school, we a way to understand that Salvadorian currently and to understand not only what they consume in a cultural sense, but how they relate with media outlets. And something that we did is that after we interviewed, carried out a survey with 1,250 people who reside in places like Texas, Florida, Houston, and obviously the metropolitan area of Washington. So after the survey, we obtained very interesting data. One of the first data we obtained is that when we asked people a very random question. It might seem random. There's a very important reason behind it. We ask them, who do you think is the person who represents El Salvador at an international level? And the prevalent answer, over 50% represent this people at an international scale, is Bukele. Second place is Monsignor Romero. Third place is Mágico González, a famous soccer player. Romero is the first saint of El Salvador. Asked this question 6 years ago, back in 2019, in first place, the answer was for Monsignor Romero, the first El Salvador saint. Second place for Mágico González, a well-known soccer player. And far in third place, president. In 6 years, this time, the president has, without a doubt, the people that have received the survey, they consider that Bukele is the person who most represents El Salvador. So it gives you a parameter to understand with certain data that official narrative is causing a very big impact that you can notice in this perception, but you also notice in the electoral results, because if we review the results from the presidential elections from last year, we realize that the people who are outside the country, they voted 97% for President Bukele. In other words, almost 100% of the El Salvador diaspora voted in favor of Bukele. So if we add both, like for example, the real concrete data, as was the data from our survey, where we asked regarding to measure the popularity within El Salvador, and we see the high numbers that he has, we can see that effectively begun by this government to speak with a well-thought strategy with the diaspora, it is without a doubt working. I agree, it's a strategy that in many countries, populist or post-reality, but it works perfectly for the purposes of this government. At least looking inside in, we're seeing that tendency to that they believe everything that is said from the official narrative is believed. However, when we start verifying some sources, you realize that possibly the lie is also an official discourse. It's an installed narrative. So the question would be that for you, what factors explain that despite the access to many sources of information and realities, not only within El Salvador, but also United States and other countries, another important part of the El Salvador diaspora adopts without questioning these official discourses, which are probably digitized, that come from the El Salvador state. It's very important to explain this. Survey that we conducted with these El Salvador citizens who live in the United States, just their cultural consumption. We asked them about their informative consumption, what media outlets they use to obtain information, and by cross-referencing data, we reached the first preliminary conclusion that this popularity, capacity to show empathy to the migrants government has to do with a series of factors, and not only with what the president does or says, so the entire ecosystem that surrounds what the president does. When we ask people what media outlets they use the most, which are the media outlets that they most use, this were noteworthy because, for example, Diario El Salvador, which is a more pro-government journal, and Noticiero, other official media outlets, it enjoys high levels of popularity. As a matter of fact, Noticiero is currently in first place, and Diario El Salvador competing with the traditional newspaper. That's the first layer, so to speak. After this, when we asked how the people they get informed, the being
youtubers o
informed
los famosos o
by
reconocidos también
following
como influencers,
YouTubers
entre
or
comillas, por
quote
llamarlo de
unquote
alguna manera.
influencers.
Resulta que hace 6 años, cuando le
6 years
preguntamos a las
ago, when we
personas,
asked,
¿y usted cómo se informa?
how do you get informed?
Los periódicos digitales
The
aparecían en una posición muy alta, casi en
newspapers
primer
were
lugar, los periódicos
almost in
digitales,
first
hace
place,
6 años.
digital
Pero hoy,
newspapers
en
years
2020,
ago.
el dato que
But
publicamos hoy
now,
tenemos
with
información del
the
2024.
data we
Le
published
hacemos la
in
misma pregunta
2025, which
y la
corresponds to
respuesta que obtenemos
2024,
es
we
que
asked the
en
same
primer lugar
question, and
es
the
lo
answers we
que le
obtained
cuentan sus
is that
familiares y
the
amigos en El Salvador.
place is what they hear
En
from their
dato más
friends and
relevante, en
relatives who
segundo
live
lugar,
in El Salvador.
son
But what's most
los
relevant,
youtubers que
second
hablan de
place, we
información
see the
política.
YouTubers
Y
who
cuando
discuss
luego
political
todavía le
topics.
preguntas un poco
And
más,
then
le preguntas qué youtubers
you
son tus
ask them,
favoritos para
which
informarte a
YouTubers are
usted
your favorite to
del
be
acontecer
informed
político en el
about
país,
what happens
resulta
in
que
the
los
country?
primeros lugares son
The
justamente
first
todos
places
aquellos
are
que
precisely
algunos
those,
artículos de prensa
some of them
han revelado
write
que son los
some
youtubers que
newspaper
tienen una
articles have
posición
revealed that they
abiertamente
are
oficialista,
YouTubers
es
who
decir,
are
abiertamente
openly or
pro gobierno.
officially they support
Y que
or,
además
or
muchos
are
de
in
estos
favor of
youtubers,
Bukele.
según
And
estos
many of
mismos
these
periodistas,
YouTubers, according
específicamente
to
de
the
un
paper
consorcio de medios llamado El
investigations
Filtro,
coming from a
reveló que
paper
se
journalist
dedicaban a
consortium called
difundir
El Filtro,
desinformación, que justamente
they
es lo que
are
tú dices. Entonces
really
tenemos a
spread
un grupo de
misinformation.
salvadoreños en el exterior, a
We
la
have a
diáspora
group of
salvadoreña,
El Salvador
informándose, por
diaspora
un
who are
lado,
being informed
con
on the one hand,
medios tradicionales oficialistas, como
traditional
noticieros
media
falsos o
outlets,
periódicos.
for example,
Y
some
luego tenemos a este mismo grupo
news
informándose
shows
con
or newspapers,
salvadoreños
and
o
then others who are
youtubers
being
salvadoreños
informed
que, según otros
thanks
medios,
to
son
El
eh,
Salvadorian
de
YouTubers
posición
who
abiertamente
have
oficialista y que
openly
replican la
support the
información
government,
oficial y
replicate
muchas
the
veces lo hacen
official
usando esa
information,
información
and
en
many
contra de
times they
ellos.
do
Y si a
spreading
eso unimos a
misinformation.
que
And if
se
you add
informan
to
con
this that they
lo que
also are
reciben de parte
what they
en las
receive
conversaciones que tienen con
from the
sus familiares aquí en
conversations
El
they have
Salvador,
with their
porque
relatives,
también el presidente, hay que decir,
or
también tiene
where we
mantiene un
have to
alto nivel de
say the
popularidad,
president is
la suma que
still very,
tenemos es
very,
a un
the
público
final
que
result
está
of this is we have
con una
a
saturación de
sector
información,
of this
pero
audience
una información que
for
no
who
necesariamente, como
receive
ellos dicen,
information
es
that
una información de
is not
calidad, sino que
necessarily
muchas veces
quality
es una
information.
información
Instead, many times
parcializada, tendenciosa y
it's
muchas otras
biased
veces también
information, and
constituye
many
de
times
desinformación. Por lo tanto, aunque
it's
tengan altos
information.
niveles de
So
información,
even if they
se debe
receive a
poner
lot of
en duda porque en
information,
realidad
you
estaríamos
have to
hablando de
question this because
que
we're
en muchos
talking
casos
about,
sea
in many
fuente de
cases,
desinformación.
high
Pero la
degrees.
suma de todas esas capas
But the sum
medios
of all these
digitales,
layers, these digital
periódicos,
media
noticieros
outlets,
oficialistas, youtubers pro gobierno,
shows, or
desinformación,
YouTubers who are
los
openly
mismos
in favor of the
medios o las redes
government,
sociales
and
y lo que conversan con sus
own
familiares,
social
la
media and
suma de
what
esas
they
capas
discuss
es lo
with
que
their
nos estaría
relatives,
dando
the
esa
sum of all
fuerza
these layers,
narrativa con lo que el gobierno
this
está llevando a
narrative
ese público.
strength with how the government is reaching this
De
audience.
acuerdo,
I
comprensible
agree.
también entonces
It's
un poco la metáfora
understandable,
de la comida chatarra con la
the
comida
metaphor
sana.
of
Hay
using junk food
muchísimas
with a
fuentes
quote
de
unquote balanced
desinformación,
diet.
como señalas,
Of
que también llevan a
misinformation, like you
pensar
mentioned,
que hay cierta
think that there's
predominancia de estos medios para
that
que la
these
gente
media
se
outlets
informe,
are
pero que también
people
implica
to be
una
informed with
visión
them, but they
cortoplacista,
also imply
una
a
visión
short-term
idealista de la realidad salvadoreña que
idealistic
no usualmente
vision of the El
corresponde
Salvador
a lo que la
reality
realidad objetiva nos dice.
necessarily
Sí,
correspond to
perdón.
what
Y
what
ahí un
the
elemento
reality
que se me olvidó
truly
mencionar fue el
shows
otro
us. And there's
elemento que es
something
el
that I forgot
elemento
to
meramente
mention, and it
patriótico.
has to do
Si hay un elemento que es
with a patriotic
que a
perspective,
través de esos mismos
because
medios que
the
consumen, a
element
través de ese
that via
noticiero, a través de ese
these
periódico, a través de ese
outlets that they
youtuber,
use, whether it's a news
que se
show,
está explotando de sobremanera es esta sensación de que
YouTuber,
hoy el
or a
país
newspaper, it's the
está mejor que nunca.
sensation where the
Y
country
ese
is
mensaje
in
de
better
verdad
shape
está calando
for,
mucho, porque si tú
and
le
that
preguntas,
message is
de
true,
hecho le
an
preguntamos en nuestra
impact, because
encuesta
if you
a la
ask, as
diáspora
a matter of fact,
salvadoreña,
we asked in
primero,
our
¿usted se siente
survey to
orgulloso
this
del
El
país?
Salvador diaspora
Primero,
if
ese
they
es el primer
feel
acto de
proud of
orgullo,
their
orgullo
country
por el país. Cuando le preguntas,
or
¿qué
high
es lo que
degrees
le hace
of
sentir orgulloso?
pride for their
La
country.
mayoría de las
What makes them
personas
feel
se va, por ejemplo, con las
proud about your
playas.
country? Most
Y
of
cuando
them
tú
answer
vas a ver
regarding their
uno de
beaches.
los principales
And
mensajes
when you
de la
go and
narrativa
see one of
oficial,
the
tiene que
main
ver con
messages
esto
of
de
the
sentirse
official
orgulloso de un
narrative
país al que
has to
llega
do with
mucha
this
gente
sensation
y
where
sobre
there
todo
are
al turismo de
many,
playa.
many, many
Hay
tourists,
que recordar,
and most
Jorge,
of all
esta
tourists
concepción
that want to go to the beach.
mercadológica
And
de las
this
salvadoreñas como Surf City, ¿no?
like this marketing strategy of areas like Surf City. When you see this, and then when you ask them, because we went to different cultural events in the United States to do this work, and when we ask them in a more qualitative way, when you ask them, what is the how do you perceive these messages? They always mention patriotism. We're talking with people like, for example, in the Washington Pupuseria, they say the other day I went to vacation. I think it was who did have their documents in order, and I went to the Dominican Republic, and I felt proud when people got excited because I was from El Salvador, and wow, that had never happened to me before. You know, sensation of feeling proud. It's something that's contributing. The person from El Salvador identified with this message that they're receiving, in particular, as if they're very convinced of what's happening. That's what's happening in El Salvador is something that's really good. At least that's what they
Y
believe.
parecería que es una
Yes, and it
construcción
might seem that it's if,
realista, como mencionaba, de acuerdo a lo que
as
nos
you
está
mentioned,
relatando también,
according to
eso
what
es
you're
algo
mentioning, this is
importantísimo
something
como factor dentro de la
important as
narrativa.
a
Es
factor
decir,
within the
vale
narrative.
más un render,
In other
vale más una
words, a
maqueta, vale más
gram or
una
a digital
reflexión
render
espontánea o
or
una idea
spontaneous
sobre políticas
or an
de
idea
construcción o
regarding
de
policies
mantenimiento
of maintaining
de ciertos lugares claves
certain
en la
crucial
conciencia salvadoreña y
in the El
asimismo esto
Salvador
de
content
realizar las obras que
and
se prometen, por
actually
ejemplo. Es
confirming
decir,
that the
parecería
works or if
que también parte de la
promise actually
narrativa
takes
es
place.
siempre
So
apostarle al
part of the
futuro, porque el
narrative
presente
is
no
always
alcanza.
betting on the future because
Sí, fíjate
the present is
que
not enough.
Amparo Marroquín en uno de
Yes,
sus artículos
Amparo Marroquín in one
nos
of
mencionaba
their
un tema,
articles
un término que es
mentioned
la
a term
tecnoutopía.
to do with the
Y él hablaba de
technical
la tecnoutopía
utopia.
como esta
And they talked
sensación
about technical
que
utopia
nos
as this
vende
feeling that
el
they
Estado salvadoreño, el gobierno salvadoreño,
Salvador
de que
or
el
El Salvador
futuro
government sells that the
tiene que ser
future,
ese estado
the
donde
that state
el
where
Bitcoin va a
Bitcoin
mandar,
is going to
en donde
the ruling
el
currency, or
turismo
where
va a mandar, donde los
tourism
edificios
is going
altos
to,
van a
where
ser los que
tall
van a mandar. Y
buildings
de hecho
are going to be the one in
una de las
charge. And we have to
apuestas
remember
también de
that
este gobierno es que
one of the
ha
biggest
estado
proposals
levantando
for this
edificios en
government
Caracas.
is
Pero claro,
stimulating really
esa
tall buildings.
infraestructura
But
no es
building
solo para que haya
these
más
elevated
vivienda, y de hecho
buildings,
los
it's
precios
not only
son
to more
inalcanzables para la
housing,
mayoría,
they are
sino tiene que ver con
they
esa
require
sensación de
unpayable
comunicar que
fees
somos
or
un país
costs,
moderno.
but also
Sí,
this
es
that they
decir,
have to
un
that
país
they are a modern
pareciera que se ve mucho más moderno si tiene más
digital
edificios altos.
country, and
Entonces,
they think that having
eso que pareciera
a more
arquitectura
modern
o
country,
planificación
so
urbana,
as if this
tiene
urban
mucho de
planning or
narrativa, tiene mucho de comunicación.
includes narrative, includes
El
communication
verse como
strategies to sell
el
themselves
lugar
as,
donde el
or
Bitcoin tiene
is the
su
place
lugar donde
where
puede llegar y
Bitcoin,
sentirse en casa
where if you
o en
own
economía.
Bitcoin,
O sea,
if you
sí,
go
sí
to El
tiene que ver
Salvador
mucho
and
con la
feel at
economía,
home,
pero sobre todo
it,
tiene que
it
ver
is related with economy, but it has more to do
con
with
venderte como un
communication, with
paraíso nuevo donde
selling
la
yourself as
tecnología
this
llega
new paradise
y el
where
futuro
technology,
va a ser ahí. Entonces,
and that's where the future will
estos
be.
constructos
All
de
these
esa
constructs of this
tecnoutopía que mencionaba
techno
Marroquín,
utopia that
justamente tiene que ver
King
con eso, con
mentioned has to do
construir
with
un
this, with
país
building a country
que
where
parece
that
tener
seems
o ir
as if it
desarrollando la
has
tecnología
or
y por lo
goes
tanto
side
sea
by
capaz de
side with
atraer a otra
technology
gente,
and is
pero
capable of
esa
attracting
sensación
more
de
people. But
atracción
that
y ese
feeling, that
empuje
sensation of attraction is
no solo
something
atrae a los
that
extranjeros,
not
sino que hace sentir
only
orgullosos a
attracts
muchas
foreign,
personas que están fuera
but
del
it
país que son
also
salvadoreñas,
makes people who
porque
are
dicen, ok,
living
por fin
abroad, makes them feel
ven
proud of being
que
El
Salvador se
Salvador
está
because
diferenciando
they
por
claim
otro
that
tipo de elementos
finally El Salvador is
y
being
no necesariamente por la
differentiates itself from
violencia antes de
different
la guerra
elements, not only
y
violence
pandemia,
prior to
sino
the
que por
war,
fin,
and
por
because
ser un
before
paraíso tecnológico, moderno,
the
turístico,
gangs, instead because it's
precisamente
a technology
el momento que
paradise.
ese
But I
paraíso
insist
tecnológico turístico
that
no
this
siempre es
technological or
único y
tourism
simplemente un
paradise is
constructo
not
comunicacional
necessarily
narrativo para venderse
a
como tal.
communications construct to sell
Efectivamente,
itself as such
eso nos
effectively.
lleva a
And
pensar también
that this narrative is allergic to some element, those harsh doses of reality affect the narrative. May was a very special month for this official since it had to face many of these doses of reality. The capture of people who are accompanying social movements and people who in vulnerable situations and fight for the human rights in El Salvador, besides all the influence from the official narrative from Donald Trump in the US, uh, people from Venezuela who are being detained or jailed in those jails, many elements that affected the official narrative. And this allowed us to see that the narrative can be breached. Question for you is, what opportunities are there to challenge the official narrative the way you described it? Well, first of all, I would like to debate the sensation that it seems that, that the government had a tough time in May, because that's what you might glean from social media, because there were complaints, especially at an international level, regarding how the government was managed, how the country was being run. We haven't seen a survey that confirms the sensation that the impressions we had in May, that this popularity was affected because of what you just mentioned. I would say that we have to be cautious when we analyze if it will affect the nurse like surveys. I understand that you see have to measure the current popularity. We'll have then is when we have real numbers to see if the government's image, if it's true or it was just a small short illusion similar to others that have taken place. So we have to wait for that to have concrete data. But how do we revert this? Well, simple question. Some things that we've discussed with other people regarding how to revert this, and it has to do with using some resources that it might seem that they're as and nobody is exploiting this. And I will give a specific example. How do we combat misinformation? We know that we are exposed to a lot of misinformation, fake news, harassment, and hate speech. How do how does this how does this hate speech or misinformation spread so much? Because they use language, very popular language and popular memes or outlets, resources that are very easy to understand. For example, memes, for example, quick messages, emotional messages, videos, social media like TikTok. So one of the conclusions that we reached regarding how to combat misinformation is by using these same resources. Who are sharing misinformation and they use the easiest enjoy resources. Those of us want to combat misinformation. We start talking in different terms, this tone, as if we were university students and math or history. Of course, on the one have those who generate misinformation with a very attractive and emotional message, and the same at this time we want to reveal what is misinformation, messages, and using outlet and resources that are not at all attractive. So there's a lack of balance that's very noticed right away. So this is where we have to way we combat these messages, this prevalence or dominance. No, it's simply about being more creative, of turning the same language from popular culture, using humor as it is proven that humor is resistant against demonic powers. There are so I've studied this, and they've shown that humor is a great way of achieving this. I would think, without having a magic wand to solve this, but at least one alternative is knowing how to use more emotional resources or that show more empathy for people instead of where civil society speaks in a serious tone, addresses its audience in a serious tone, or informing why you should not believe misinformation. 2 hour long boring video regarding why we should combat misinformation or how can we make sure we don't believe misinformation. Of course, if we do it this way, we're competing against a monster that has creative resources to create misinformation. We're combating it with attractive or unattractive resources. So it's an uphill battle. One way to do so is to find more creative ways so that this discourse filled with misinformation is overcome in this way. There are other more long-term strategies which would help us, and it has to do with, for example, in El Salvador, this topic of media and informational literacy. Media and information literacy is simply teaching people media competencies so they can discern or differentiate between hate speeches and biased information, differentiated from real information. And we feel that if at a young as boys and girls, we create these competencies in them so that the audiences can be critical with the narratives that they consume in social media and different media outlets. And of course, in the long term, it could help us to regardless of how powerful and overwhelming it is. In order to obtain true media and information literacy at a school age, we need support from the staff through the school system. And this contradiction because I'm not sure if the state, who is one of the promoters of misinformation in some cases, will also will be the one to ensure that people have tools leave misinformation. It's somewhat of a contradiction, ironic. In that sense, it's difficult. Another way to more critical audiences so that they can get to know how the outlets operate, how messages are built, and how the messages directly impact in the perception. That's what comes to, those are two things that come to mind regarding what we can do. Without a doubt, there are more that we can do, but those are two things we're solving. Perfect. Thank you very much for your reflections regarding these important topics. To the time that we have left, we're going to open a space for questions from the audience, and we're going to read some of them that we received. You have control of how you can answer them in as short time as possible so we can have more time to answer all of them. We're going to begin with the first one, which has to do that if, in your opinion, all societies need or seek heroes, or something particular to certain societies or countries. This is something that Grecia sent us via Ulysses. But what do you think? Do all societies need heroes or seek heroes, or does it only apply to certain societies? I haven't all societies, but I would tell you that it's something very, very common in Latin America because we've seen it in Venezuela or Colombia, Argentina, Mexico,
incluso en Centroamérica,
even in
¿no?
Central America.
Entonces yo te diría, no, o sea, no
So
es que
I
me
would
digas que es algo
say, I
común
wouldn't
en
dare
todas
say
las
that's something
sociedades
that
del
happens
mundo,
in all
pero sí
societies
lo
throughout the
podemos
world, but we can
extrapolar a
say
América
that
Latina,
you
donde
extrapolate it to
definitivamente
Latin
siempre hay una
America, where
tendencia a buscar
there's
héroes,
a tendency to seek
porque,
you
bueno, hay un autor, Omar
because there's
Rincón, que él habla mucho de
an
la,
author named Omar
compara,
Rincon.
compara
He
este mundo de la
compares
política con las
this world of
telenovelas, y
soap
él
operas,
habla mucho de esta
and
parte,
he
que
talks a
es
lot
que
about
tenemos esta
these,
tendencia a
that we
dramatizar,
have this tendency to
¿sí? Entonces, en esa
dramatize things.
tendencia a dramatizar, por eso
So
nos
this
gustan tanto las
tendency to
telenovelas, esa
dramatize,
tendencia a
and this is why
dramatización
we
siempre
love
hará
soap
villanos,
operas.
siempre
There will
hará el
always be
bueno
heroes.
de
We'll
la
always be
novela,
the
¿verdad?
good guy
Entonces,
and the bad guy in the
eso
soap
hace
opera.
que, y él hace la
Causes,
comparación, Omar
and
Rincón,
he
que
makes a
hay telepresidentes,
comparison
que estos
that there are
telepresidentes suelen ser
telepresidents,
héroes
that these
que a veces vienen de la derecha, a veces vienen de la
telepresidents
izquierda
are
y otras
these
veces son
heroes,
insurgentes,
sometimes left
pero
wing,
que
others right or
procuran
in the middle,
eh,
who try to ensure
dominar la
that
narrativa para hacerse
to
ver como
dominate
ese
the
héroe que
perceived that as that
desarma a
hero
ese
who
villano primero, y
disarms
muchas veces
that
suelen ser los villanos de las telenovelas, ¿verdad? Entonces,
are the
creo
types of
yo que
villains
por
we
lo
see in
menos en
soap
América
operas.
Latina
So I
es
would
una
think that in
tendencia bastante marcada
Latin
y que
America,
como
it's a
cualquiera
very
podría
marked
decirlo, es decir,
tendency. It's not new.
los
I
caudillos
think that those
y las grandes figuras
political
vienen
figures
del siglo
and other
pasado,
types of
¿verdad?
figures, we've seen them in from the past century, at least in our
Muchas
region.
gracias. Tenemos otra
Thank you very
pregunta
much. We
que
have
dice,
another
¿cómo
question,
se
and it
explica
asks,
la
how can you
influencia
explain
de las personas salvadoreñas en el
of the people
exterior,
in El
considerando
Salvador
que no
in, who live
viven los
abroad,
desafíos
take in
de la
consideration that
cotidianidad
they
del
don't
país?
face the
¿Es la influencia
experience
económica de
in
las
a day-to-day life
remesas, el
within the
vínculo
country,
desde Estados
whether
Unidos,
it
o
has to
cómo
do
se
with
explica algo así?
remittances? Do
Para
you
mí
think
son
it
dos
has to do with
cosas, la
something
influencia
else? In
económica y
my
la influencia
opinion, it has
política.
to do with
O sea,
political
económicamente está
influence and
clarísimo que este
cultural.
país depende en gran medida de las remesas.
Speaking, it's clear the country
El
depends on
aporte al
remittances.
Producto Interno Bruto de
The
la remesa es
contribution
sumamente alto.
to the
Mucho
GDP
del
is
consumo
very
de este
high. A
país
lot of what they
se
consume in
sostiene
this
y mantiene
country
gracias a la
is
remesa. Entonces,
sustained or maintained
esa
thanks to
influencia
remittance.
económica
So
sin
that
duda le da
political, that economic
importancia y mucha relevancia a
influence
la
will
diáspora
give a lot of
salvadoreña.
relevance
Pero
and
luego hay un
importance
elemento
to the El
cultural
Salvador diaspora.
digamos que donde más
There's
he trabajado
another
yo el
culture
tema y que es
I've worked the
innegable, es
most
decir,
on,
el
and
impacto
it's
cultural
undeniable
de la
the
diáspora
cultural
salvadoreña
impact of the El
en ambas
Salvador
vías.
diaspora
Ojo,
in
no
both
solo
avenues, not
a los que estamos acá en El
only
Salvador
for those of
nos
us
influye
in El
la gente que viene de Estados
Salvador
Unidos, sino que también
influenced by
nosotros
people from El
influimos en
Salvador,
ellos. Es
United
decir,
States. We also
hasta ir a
influence them
Washington o a la zona
to
metropolitana de Washington para
Washington or
darte
to the
cuenta de la
metropolitan
influencia que tiene El
in
Salvador allá.
Washington to
Pero
realize the
también hace
influence.
falta venir a El Salvador, específicamente a
But
muchos
you also
lugares
have
de
to
Oriente, para darte
go to
cuenta de
many
la influencia
parts in
cultural que
the
tiene también
west
los
or eastern part
dialectos
of El
en nuestro
Salvador
país.
to understand the
En nuestro
influence of the
país son
diaspora
muy
in
populares
the
las
country.
fiestas populares,
The popular
las fiestas
party,
patronales, o sea,
the
cuando se celebran las fiestas de los pueblos.
the parties who are
Entonces,
celebrating in the
estos
villages
suelen ser
or
días en
neighborhoods or
los que viene mucha
communities.
diáspora
These are occasions
y eso
where the diaspora
sí,
comes to
eso es
visit
un
again.
traslado de cultura, es
And
decir,
it's a cultural
una cultura
transference where we are immersed
transnacional tan
in a
importante que ha
transnational
vuelto
culture that's so
sumamente relevante
important
el papel
that has become that
el
has
papel de la
caused
diáspora.
the
Y
role
eso
of the
creo yo que
diaspora
lo
to
tienen
become
claro
very,
ellos, o sea, las personas que
and they
viven
are
fuera lo
very,
tienen muy
those who
claro.
live abroad are very
Quizás
clear
no
about this.
conscientemente, a lo mejor
Maybe not
inconscientemente, pero sí
consciously,
saben que
maybe unconsciously,
tiene un gran
but they do
impacto económico
that
y sobre todo
they have
tienen
a
un gran
big
impacto
economic
cultural que para
impact
mí
and a cultural
en
impact
los
that, in my
últimos 5 años
opinion,
ha dejado
in the
de ser
last
meramente
5 years,
cultural y económico y se
it
ha
has
reflejado
no
ahora
longer been
políticamente,
only
pues. Y eso es el
political,
resultado de las elecciones
economic, and
también
cultural.
que nos
It's
dice
become
mucho.
political as well, and
De
the
acuerdo.
electoral results
Hace
show us
recordar
this. I
perfectamente
agree.
casi el mito de
We
Ipuca
remember
City, ¿verdad?
Por
the
allá,
myth
por allá,
Fue
sí.
primero que
Ibuka
Surf City.
City.
Por
It was
allá, sí.
prior to Surf
Tenemos
City.
otra pregunta,
We
William. No
have
sé si
another
esa es un
question,
poco
William.
más,
It has to do more
eh,
with
un poco más compleja. Dice, sobre el punto de por qué la
has to
diáspora
do with
acepta
regarding
tanto
why
la
the
versión oficial de
diaspora
las cosas, entre
accepts the
comillas.
official
A esta
version of
persona le interesaría
the quote
conocer si
unquote
sabe,
official version of
en
things.
tus estudios se sabe
Know
estratificar
that
a
if
las
in your
personas que
studies
participan en estas
can
encuestas, es
you
decir, los
determine
datos
if
demográficos, si son de clase media
saying the
baja o de
demographic data of
escolaridad.
these people who
En esa
participate in the
misma línea,
surveys,
si eso
and
puede
in the
servir
same
para
line of
saber un
thinking,
poco
if this could
respecto a la
help us
situación
understand
socioeconómica de la población.
the economic situation of the
Sí, en la
people.
encuesta obviamente se pregunta por sus ingresos económicos y
And it
te
has to
soy
do with
sincero,
their,
los resultados
these
son
surveys
bastante
tell us about their
parecidos
economic income, and
independientemente
the results
de los
are very
ingresos
similar,
económicos, también
regardless of these factors,
independientemente
and
de si son
regardless
hombres o mujeres
if it's a man or a woman
quienes contestaban.
or who are the people that
E
responded to the
quizás
surveys.
es curioso, pero sí
Maybe
hay
it's
cierta
curious,
especie de
but there's a
orgullo
certain
o
degree of
de sentirse orgulloso
pride
por la patria, más
or
sobre todo en los adultos.
patriotism, especially when
Eso
it comes to
notamos, es decir,
adults.
las personas
We did notice
de
that
40,
that
50, 60
people that
años hacia
were
arriba,
40, 50,
que son
60-year-olds
aquellos que
or
probablemente
older,
crecieron en El
those who
Salvador
were probably
y
born in
se
El
fueron y se fueron
Salvador,
extrañando
and
la
they
cumbia,
left
etcétera, las
and
pupusas
left
y todo.
missing
Y
cumbia
probablemente
music
los
and
jóvenes
pupusas. And in the case of the
nacieron allá,
youngsters,
solo son
they were
salvadoreños,
born in the United
descendientes salvadoreños
States.
solo por la influencia de sus
They
padres. Entonces
they feel
probablemente
they
sienten
belong to the country because of the
una patria
influence
mejor,
of their
pero aún así
parents.
te diré
So they might
que uno
not
de sus
feel
niveles
that
altos
proud or that
allá,
much patriotism.
los datos
But
concretos si gustan,
the
ahí te van a
specific,
compartir el estudio,
from what I understand, we're going to
pero ahí
share
sí
the
hay
official
algunos
data
datos
later
cruzados
on.
justamente
But there's some
por hombre, mujer,
cross-reference
por
data
edades,
to men,
no lo
women,
cruzan
age groups.
tanto
We didn't
por condición
cross-reference
socioeconómica, pero según lo que
the
recuerdo
condition,
también hay
but
algo
from what I
parecido, es decir,
remember, it's very, very
diferencias
similar.
estadísticas significativas,
It's
quizás la más importante es por edad,
not many
sin
significant
ser demasiado alta la edad.
statistical data.
Creo que los adultos
I think that in the case
de
of
40, 50,
adults
60 hacia
who
arriba son
are
quienes
40,
más
50, or
muestran esa
60 or
sensación
older are the ones
de
who
orgullo,
most
pero
show that
también tengo
sensation of
registros
pride.
de
But if
jóvenes
we look at the
también
data of the
admiran mucho al
youngsters,
presidente.
they
Y
also
jóvenes,
admire
me refiero a
the
jóvenes que
president.
viven en Estados Unidos, jóvenes
When I
salvadoreños
refer
que
to
viven en Estados
youngsters, I
Unidos,
refer to
también
those
lo
who live
admiran.
abroad and who live in the US. They
Entonces,
also admire him.
yo creo que la edad podría
I
ser
think that
hay una
it
pequeña
could,
diferencia estadística
there's a
significativa, pero
small,
en general, lo que te he
generally
comentado
speaking,
podría
what
aplicarse
I've
a la gran
mentioned
mayoría de
could, you
salvadoreños.
could apply to the vast majority of
De acuerdo,
those Salvadorians who
de
live in the United
acuerdo.
States.
Una
I
pregunta
agree.
más,
One more
bajo el
question.
arquetipo de héroes y
Under
villanos
the
nuevamente,
archetype
en
of
El
heroes and
Salvador el
villains again,
periodismo
in El
independiente y los
Salvador,
defensores de derechos
independent
humanos
journalism and
serían
human
villanos.
rights defenders, are they considered
Pregunta
villains?
persona
Claro,
participante.
This is a question. Of course,
según la
yes.
narrativa oficial, sí, ¿verdad?
According to the official narrative, yes, they
Definitivamente.
are definitely villains.
Y de hecho creo que son de los
As a
villanos,
matter of
según la
fact,
narrativa oficial, más fuertes.
according to the official narrative,
Porque al
they're
fin y al
one
cabo
of the
son los que están
strongest villains
revelando
because at the end of the
diferentes
day,
casos de
they are the
corrupción,
ones that are revealing
diferentes
different corruption
irregularidades en el
cases,
tema de la
different
seguridad, etcétera.
disparities when
Entonces,
it comes to
por lo
security.
menos desde el punto de
So,
vista oficial lo
at
son.
least
Ahora,
from
obviamente,
according to the official
yo
narrative,
no
yes,
comparto eso. Yo creo obviamente
course,
que
I don't share
en realidad
this
hasta
version.
diría yo,
Even I
deberían
would
ser los medios de comunicación, en
media
realidad,
outlets
los
should
verdaderos héroes en
truly
este
be
caso
the real
que estamos viviendo. Es
heroes
decir, probablemente en unos
we're
años, cuando
experiencing right
recordemos
now.
estos
Maybe in
tiempos,
some years when we
todos estos
look back
hallazgos
on these
publicados en medios
times,
de
all
comunicación
these findings
independientes del
published by
poder,
independent
sin
media
duda serán los que
outlets will be the ones
eh, contarán la historia
who will
de
tell
mejor
the
forma.
story.
Sí, entonces yo creo
So
que ahí está uno de los grandes retos, ¿verdad? Y
I
creo que el
think that
reto más
that's where
difícil
we face the
es
biggest challenge.
revertir esa
And the biggest
sensación de que los
challenge
medios
is
de
to
comunicación
revert
son
those that
los
idea or that
villanos,
perception
porque
that media
créeme, es todo
outlets
lo contrario. De
are
hecho,
the
fíjate que en la
villains. And
encuesta
the reality is quite the
hicimos ese cruce
contrary.
entre las
In the
personas
survey,
que
we
dicen que el
cross-reference
presidente
between those
Bukele es
people
el
who
máximo
think that
representante de El Salvador
the
internacionalmente.
best
Entre estas
representative of
personas, medios como
Salvador,
El Faro,
among these
Facto,
people, media outlets
bajan
like El Faro,
y medios como Diario El Salvador,
they go
como
down
Noticiero El
when it comes to
Salvador,
results,
suben.
and
Entonces ahí lo que nos
pro-government
está
media
diciendo algo,
outlets
es decir,
go
no
up. This
podemos
tells us something. We
decirles.
cannot
Ahora,
say
es una cuestión
it has
de
nothing
una
to do
reacción. Si leo
with a
esto
reaction. Oh,
porque
if I read this,
admiro
it's
al presidente. No, pero
because
sí
I
es
president.
interesante
No,
notar ese dato
it's interesting to
de
note
cómo hay
that data
personas
regarding how they are
que entre más idealizan la
that
figura del
the more
presidente,
they idealize
menos
the figure of
consumen
the president,
algunos medios
the
considerados
less
políticos
they
como El Faro
consume
o El
certain
Salvador,
media
por ejemplo.
considered
Ok, ok.
anti-government, such as El
Interesante.
Faro.
También
Interesting, and
nos
also
preguntaba esta persona
this
si
person
hay alguna
also
forma
asked
de
us if there's a
moverse, de
way
sacarse de ese rol de villano,
to
pero como nos
way
indicas,
to
es con una cuestión de
separate from
tiempo,
this image of being a
probablemente es una
villain,
cuestión
but
muy
as you
difícil
mentioned, it
de
might be
hacer
something
en este
difficult
momento,
to do or
pero
something that will take a lot of
probablemente
time. But I
la
think
realidad misma
that
se encargará
the
de dar los indicios de
reality
personas
itself
en
or
este momento.
history will
Sí, a
put
ver,
it on the
yo
right
creo que,
side or
y lo dice el mismo
accurately
periodista,
display
¿no? O sea,
its role
ante
in
esta
history. Yes, some
oleada de ataques que están
journalists
sufriendo
have
de
mentioned
comunicación
because of this wave
en
of
El
attacks
Salvador,
suffered
yo
by
creo que la única
independent
respuesta
El
posible es seguir
Salvador,
haciendo
the
periodismo.
only possible answer
Yo
is
comparto con
continue
eso, o sea,
exercising their role as journalists.
no puedes hacer
That
más
answer.
que
You
tu
cannot do
trabajo,
more than
seguirlo
what
haciendo
your
y
work
claro, ahorita
allows you to
cada vez es más
do
difícil
your work
hacerlo, ¿verdad?
well. Of
No
course,
porque no
it's
puedan, no
difficult to
porque sea
do it
incapaz,
well,
sino
not
porque,
because they
sino
cannot or are
porque
incapable of doing it.
las condiciones cada vez son más
Instead,
difíciles para
because
los
conditions
periodistas,
are
¿verdad?
more and
Entonces,
more
en ese sentido,
difficult for
creo yo
journalists. So, in that sense, I think that
en ese ambiente tan difícil,
in such a
la única
difficult
respuesta
environment,
posible
the only
seguirá siendo
possible
seguir haciendo
will
periodismo. Lo que pasa es que
continue doing
Exactamente.
their work.
Exactamente, exactamente. Parece que las fuentes de
Exactly.
información
It
son cada
seems
vez más escasas
information
en el
resources
país.
are more and more scarce in
Además,
the country.
también
Besides
pensábamos
this, we
mucho con
also
este
thought a
tema
lot with
con
this topic
respecto
with
a
regards to
qué fuentes,
what
nos decía una
sources.
persona en una
A
pregunta, qué
person
fuentes
asked us in a
alternativas
question,
o
what
alternativas tenemos
alternative
para
sources or
informarnos, qué
attractive
ejemplos
sources
podrías
do we
dar
have
de
to
las
be
opciones que
informed? What
existen
examples
actualmente para
can
las
you give us
personas,
about the options
tanto
that
en El
currently exist
Salvador como en
for
cualquier
that
otro
the
país,
people in El
en Estados
Salvador or
Unidos, para
any other country
informarse adecuadamente?
be informed
Yo
properly?
creo que hay medios de
I
comunicación que
think
se han
that there
diferenciado
are media outlets who have
por tener
been
una postura
differentiated
bastante
throughout the
crítica,
years
lo
by
cual no los
having a
vuelve
critical
necesariamente
stance,
opositores, porque eso
which
también
does
es
not necessarily mean that they're
otro mensaje
opposition,
muy
because
repetido
that's
por parte del gobierno, de que
another
si yo
message that's
critico al
repeated by
gobierno
the
o si un medio de
official
comunicación
by the
critica al
government
gobierno,
that
automáticamente
if
me vuelvo opositor.
it's
Pues no,
criticize the government,
son
they
medios de
become
comunicación
opposition. No, they're simply
que
media outlets
parecen
doing their
opositores
job
por algún
that
tipo
they
de
might
contenido, pues
seem
eso es la
opposition
interpretación de
because
la
of
gente,
certain
pero yo
content.
creo que
That might
simplemente
be
son
the
medios de
interpretation of the
comunicación haciendo su
people,
trabajo.
but they are
Entonces,
media
dentro de estos
outlets
medios de
doing their
comunicación
job.
haciendo su trabajo,
Among these media outlets
pues
doing
se
their
puede
job,
destacar obviamente
you
las
can
noticias
highlight
o
obviously the work done by El
centralistas de los
Faro.
últimos años, pero junto
What
con
they've
ellos
done
habían
is
otros
amazing,
medios
but along them the
como el
other media
Factum,
outlets
como
such
el
as
Dato Cerrado,
Factu, such
como
as Catu
Focos, como La Araca,
Poco, Laraca,
eh, y sumado a algunos medios
and
tradicionales que
adding
también han
some
tomado una
traditional
postura
media
muy
outlets who
crítica.
have
Hablo del
taken a
Diario de
critical
Hoy y el
stance. I'm
de
talking
la
about
prensa gráfica.
Diario El
Sobre todo
Ol,
el Diario de Hoy en los
Diario de
últimos
Hoy, and
meses
Prensa
ha tomado una
Gráfica,
postura
especially Diario de Hoy,
bastante
has
crítica
taken
a las acciones del
a
gobierno.
critical
Entonces creo que
stance.
estos medios
Because of
podrían
the
ser una buena manera.
media outlets could be a good
Luego
way
digamos que una camada
to be
de
in.
TikTokers
Then there's a certain
que
group
están
of
intentando también hacer
influencers on
un
TikTok who are
contrapeso
attempting
desde las redes
to
sociales. O sea, no son
provide a
necesariamente
counter
periodistas,
narrative. They're not necessarily
pero sí son
journalists,
gente
but they are
que está
people
usando las
who
mismas redes
are
que hicieron
using
tan
the
fuerte
same
al discurso
media
oficial
outlets
para
that
poder
strengthen
contrarrestar.
the
Entonces
official
creo
discourse to
que hay que
counteract.
saber buscar. Si uno
So we
empieza
have
a
to
buscar
just know how
como el
to find them,
Faro
how
y otros
to,
de los que
if we
mencioné,
use sources
muy
like
pronto el algoritmo te va a llevar en
I mentioned,
TikTok
the
a esos
algorithm will
otros
lead you to
personas que están también teniendo una
these
actitud
other
bastante crítica a lo que plantea el
or
gobierno.
have
Y
critical
luego también creo
stances
que desde la
on what
academia
the
también se puede
government
hacer
does.
bastante,
And
¿verdad? O sea,
a
yo
lot
creo
can be done from the
que las
academy as well.
universidades
I think that the
también están teniendo un
universities
papel
are
interesante y
also
están llamadas a
playing an
tenerlo, ¿verdad?
important and they're called to
Como ha
do
sido
so
a lo largo de la historia del
uh,
país y de toda Latinoamérica.
as done throughout history
Sin duda, sin duda. Bajo riesgo de despertar del sueño de
under
la
the risk
pesadilla, ¿no? De
waking you up
darse
from
cuenta de lo que está
the
pasando
nightmare
realmente.
of realizing what's
Una
happening.
pregunta más,
One more
Wilmer.
question for you.
Esta información sobre la
This
diáspora nos invita a
information about
preguntar,
the
nos hace una
diaspora
participante por el
invites
nivel
us to
de
ask
educación y de
about the
conocimiento
level
crítico
of
de estas
education
personas.
and critical
La pregunta es,
these
¿cómo
people who are
lograr que
surveyed.
las
The
personas
question is,
cuestionen la
how can we
información
get
que
people to
consumen?
question the information they consume
Generando competencias mediáticas.
by
O sea, a ver,
generating
¿qué significa generar
media
competencias mediáticas?
competencies? What does it
Significa que
mean to
tenemos que crear
generate media
la competencia de
we have to create the competency of
analizar.
able to
Perdón,
analyze.
primero sería acceder.
First, sorry,
Hay que saber
to
acceder a la
access.
información.
Know
Después hay
how
que
to
saber
access the
analizar la
information,
información.
and then know how to
Pero
analyze
ahora ya ni
information.
siquiera basta
But
con
you it's not enough with receiving it, but many times, many are producers. So now it's necessary so that when we produce ethical and at the same time, you have to be critical. And this is taking into consideration that many people in the diaspora, they create content because that's important. We have many people in the diaspora, TikTok content or YouTube content, create music or artwork, similar. All these people produce content. So I think it's important generating media competencies. We generate for those for those who analyze it as well so that all the parts of this process of these because you're no longer consumers you are at all levels at all processes all stages of this process we maintain a critical attitude. How do we achieve critical attitude? With providing knowledge to people, understand how news is produced. If people understand who produces the news, if people understand that all news production has a specific interest, and that the sum of all these elements affects the information that I receive, this is how people will be capable to be critical content that they are receiving. But if, for example, people are not aware that I have when I publish news, or the government has interest, or a YouTuber has specific share the news. If we are not aware of that interest, we will not have all the analyzed in the best way possible. If it's quality information that we're receiving, or in the worst of cases, it's fake. Thank you very much, William. We have one final question, knowing about your trade or your profession as an educator. It's a very question. What options exist online so that we can receive training information to create attractive and informative messages? If you want to do it at a formal level, obviously the university do it. But if they want something that's less formal education and more technical, at least here in El Salvador, we have Alphabeta Media. It's a laboratory where we try to provide training in topics that have to do with media and informational literacy to give better competencies for our audiences that have critical. We have a series of courses or workshops. What happens is that lately they're done more as in-person workshops or trainings. So it's difficult if people live abroad, but if you can follow us on social media by looking for Alphabeta Media, I'm sharing the link right now in the chat. You can find us or contact us and we can organize more specialized workshops regarding media competence. But in general terms, what we do is more in-person and in the interior parts of the country. But we have done some online work, and in the future we can also replicate it as well. Thank you very much, William. We've reached the end of this very, very valuable informative session. We want to give you thanks on behalf of Alianza Americas for your participation, and especially because of your brilliant answers regarding difficult topics of what happens in El Salvador. So we are this series of webinars regarding El Salvador. We want to give thanks to accompanied us today and to all the people who participated in the prior sessions. We discussed complex yet urgent topics, human rights, state of emergency, and today the impact of the official narrative on the lives of El Salvador citizens. And you can asking questions, having dialogues, and building critical thoughts outside the country. It's a way of resistance and provides hope. Thank you for being part of this collective effort. We say goodbye, opening more space for analysis and collective dialogue. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Goodbye.